Chapter 1. The discovery. The Rio Grande carved its muddy path through the New Mexico territory like a scar across weathered leather, and Marshal Jake Morrison had been following its banks for 3 days straight. The summer of 1885 had been merciless, turning the landscape into a furnace of red earth and brittle sage. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Duchess, picked her way carefully down the rocky embankment toward the water's edge, her hooves sending small avalanches of pebbles into the sluggish current. Jake pulled his hat low against the glare and wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dusty sleeve. At 34, he'd been wearing a badge for almost half his life, first as a deputy in Kansas, then as a territorial marshal out here in the wild country. He'd built his reputation on 3 simple rules: follow the law to the letter, never get personally involved, and trust no one completely. These principles had kept him alive and respected in a land where both were hard to come by. The warrant in his saddlebags was for a man named Vicente Castellanos, wanted for cattle rustling and murder. The trail had led him south along the river, through a maze of mesas and canyons where a man could disappear forever if he knew the country. Jake had been gaining ground steadily, following tracks and asking questions in the scattered settlements. But now the sign had gone cold. As Duchess lowered her head to drink, Jake dismounted and stretched his aching back. The silence of the desert was almost complete, broken only by the gentle lapping of water and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. He was reaching for his canteen when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A metallic clink, like chain links brushing against stone. Jake froze, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt .45 at his hip. The sound came again, from somewhere upstream, around a bend where cottonwoods grew thick along the bank. He secured Duchess's reins to a fallen log and moved forward on foot, his boots silent on the sandy soil. But he found made his blood run cold. She was sitting in the shade of the largest cottonwood, her back against its massive trunk. Iron shackles circled both ankles, connected by a heavy chain that had been secured around the tree's base with a padlock. Her dress, once probably white or pale blue, was now stained with dirt and dried blood. Dark hair hung in tangled curtains around a face that couldn't have belonged to anyone older than 20, but it was her eyes that stopped Jake in his tracks. They held no fear, no plea for help, just a weary resignation that spoke of horrors beyond his imagination. When she looked up at him, she didn't even flinch at the sight of his drawn weapon. "You're not one of them," she said quietly, her voice hoarse but steady. "You're a lawman." Jake holstered his gun and knelt beside her, examining the shackles. They were old but solid, the kind used on chain gangs. "What's your name, Miss Elena Vasquez?" She spoke with only the faintest trace of an accent. "Are you going to help me, or are you going to ask questions until they come back?" "Who's they?" Jake was already pulling out his lockpicks, a skill he'd learned during his less lawful youth. "Vicente Castellanos and his men. They took me from my father's ranch 3 days ago." Her matter-of-fact tone was more disturbing than tears would have been. "My father wouldn't pay what they wanted, so they decided to keep me as payment." Jake's jaw tightened. Vicente Castellanos, the very man he'd been hunting. "How many men?" 5, including Vicente. "They rode out this morning to scout your movements, Marshal. They know you're following them." The lock was trickier than Jake had expected, its mechanism fouled with rust and sand. As he worked, Elena watched him with those disturbingly calm eyes. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because it's right," Jake replied without thinking, then paused. In 15 years of law enforcement, he'd learned that doing what was right and following the law weren't always the same thing. His orders were to bring in Castellanos, preferably alive for trial. Getting involved in a rescue mission could compromise the entire operation. "They'll be back before sunset," Elena continued. "If you're still here when they return, they'll kill us both." Jake glanced at the sun, already beginning its descent toward the western mountains. He had perhaps 3 hours of daylight left. The smart play would be to ride back to the nearest town, telegraph for backup, and return with a proper posse, by the book, clean and legal. The lock clicked open. Elena stared at her freed ankles for a long moment, then slowly stood up. She swayed slightly, and Jake caught her arm to steady her. Her skin was burning with fever. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded, though Jake wasn't convinced. "There's something else you should know, Marshal. Vicente has been using me to send messages to my father. He's demanded not just money, but information about cattle shipments, mine payrolls, anything valuable moving through our territory. If you let me go back to him, ... "You're not going back to him," Jake said firmly. "My father will pay," Elena continued as if he hadn't spoken. "He'll give Vicente everything he wants to get me back safely, and then Vicente will kill us both anyway, because that's who he is." Jake studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. In his experience, victims of violent crimes were often too traumatized to think clearly. But Elena Vasquez seemed to understand her situation with terrible clarity. More importantly, she was right about one thing: Castellanos was a killer. Jake had seen the aftermath of the man's handiwork in 3 different territories. "My horse is downstream," Jake said, making his decision. "Can you make it that far?" Elena took a tentative step, then another. "I think so." As they made their way back to where Duchess waited, Jake found himself calculating distances and times. The nearest town was Mesilla, a hard day's ride to the northeast. They could make it by dawn if they rode through the night, but Elena's condition worried him. She was clearly suffering from exposure and dehydration, maybe worse. Marshal Elena said as they reached the horse. You don't understand what you're risking. Vicente has friends in the territorial government, men who profit from his activities. When word gets out that you helped me escape? One problem at a time, Jake replied, helping her into the saddle. As his hands circled her waist, he could feel how thin she'd become. The bastards had been starving her. He swung up behind her, and Duchess snorted in protest at the extra weight. Easy girl, Jake murmured, gathering the reins. As they started upstream, away from the cottonwood grove, he tried to push down the voice in his head that kept repeating his 3 cardinal rules. Follow the law. Don't get involved. Trust no one. He was already breaking the first 2, and Elena Vasquez was making the third seem like a luxury he couldn't afford. Chapter 2. The choice. By the time the sun touched the horizon, they had covered nearly 10 miles. Following game trails and dry orioles that kept them away from the main routes, Elena had said little during the ride, but Jake could feel the tension in her body every time Duchess stumbled or shied at shadows. She was holding herself together through sheer will, and he wondered how long that resolve would last. They paused. At a natural tank carved into the rock by centuries of flash floods, while Duchess drank, Jake helped Elena down from the saddle. She immediately sank to her knees beside the water, cupping it in her hands and drinking deeply. Not too much at once, Jake cautioned. You'll make yourself sick. Elena nodded, but continued drinking in small sips. When she finally sat back, some color had returned to her cheeks. How far to Mesilla? 20 miles? Maybe 25? Jake checked his pocket watch. We'll need to rest the horse soon, but we can't stop for long. They'll track us, Elena said with certainty. Vicente is Apache on his mother's side. He can follow a trail over solid rock. Jake had suspected as much from the sign he'd been following. It explained how Castellanos had stayed ahead of the law for so long. Then we need to make sure there's no trail to follow. He led Duchess into the water and started upstream. The horse's hooves silent on the rocky bottom. Elena followed without complaint, though Jake could see the effort it cost her. The water was perhaps 2 feet deep at its center, cold with mountain snowmelt, despite the desert heat. They followed the stream for nearly a mile before Jake felt it was safe to emerge on the opposite bank. The rocky ground would hold fewer tracks, and the approaching darkness would make following their trail nearly impossible, even for someone with Apache blood. As they prepared to mount up again, Elena caught Jake's arm. Marshal Morrison, she said, and he realized he'd never told her his name. There's something I haven't told you. About my father's ranch? About why Vicente really wants it. Jake waited, though every instinct screamed at him to keep moving. 3 months ago, a survey team came through our land. Government men, with official papers. They were looking for something specific, not gold or silver, but something they called strategic minerals. My father overheard them talking about a railroad spur, about military contracts. Elena's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Vicente knows about this. He's not just a cattle rustler anymore. Marshal, he's working for men who want to control the mineral rights in this territory. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. If Elena was right, then Castellanos wasn't just a common criminal. He was part of a larger conspiracy involving territorial officials and possibly federal contracts. The kind of conspiracy that could make Jake's badge worthless, or worse, make him a target. How do you know all this? Jake asked. Because my father was offered money to sell his land. A lot of money, from men in expensive suits who came all the way from Santa Fe when he refused. Elena gestured to her torn dress, her bruised face. This was their next offer. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd told him. He'd been a lawman long enough to know that territorial politics were a snake pit of competing interests, corrupt officials, and backroom deals. But he'd always stayed clear of such entanglements, focusing on simple, clear-cut cases where right and wrong were obvious. This was no longer simple. If what you're saying is true, Jake said slowly, then bringing you to Mesilla might not be safe. Those men in expensive suits probably have friends there too. Elena nodded grimly. That's why I told you. You've already risked your career by helping me. I won't have your death on my conscience too. Jake looked at her, the first time since finding her by the river. Despite everything she'd endured, despite her obvious fear and exhaustion, she was trying to protect him. In 15 years of law enforcement, he'd rescued dozens of people from dangerous situations, but none of them had ever worried about his safety more than their own. There's another option, Jake said finally. Fort Stanton is about 40 miles northeast of here. It's a military post, outside the territorial jurisdiction. If there really is a federal contract involved, the Army might be very interested in what you have to say. 40 miles, Elena repeated. Can we make it? Jake studied the darkening sky. Duchess was tired but not exhausted, and the cooler night air would be easier on all of them. More importantly, the soldiers at Fort Stanton answered to Washington, not to territorial politicians. We can make it, he said, helping her back into the saddle, but it means traveling through the night. through country I don't know as well as I'd like. As they rode out into the gathering darkness, Jake found himself thinking about the rules that had governed his life for so long. Following the law to the letter seemed meaningless when the law itself might be corrupt. Not getting personally involved was impossible when he was already neck-deep in a conspiracy that could destroy both their lives. And trusting no one completely was a luxury he couldn't afford when Elena Vasquez was the only person who could help him understand what he'd stumbled into. The moon was rising behind them, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Somewhere, in that darkness, Vicente Castellanos and his men were probably following their trail, guided by skills that made them as dangerous as any predator the territory had ever known. But for the first time in years, Jake Morrison found himself caring more about doing what was right than what was legal. It was a dangerous feeling, and he knew it could get them both killed. He also knew he didn't have a choice. Chapter 3. The pursuit. The first shot came just after midnight, kicking up sand 3 feet to their left. Jake heard the distant crack of the rifle, a heartbeat later, echoing off the canyon walls that rose on either side of their path. He spurred Duchess forward, feeling Elena's arms tighten around his waist as the mare lunged into a gallop. "Stay low," Jake shouted over the thunder of hoofbeats. A second shot whined overhead, close enough that he could feel the wind of its passage. They had been following what appeared to be an old Apache trail through a maze of arroyos and narrow canyons, hoping the broken terrain would slow any pursuit. Instead, it had become a trap. The high walls channeled them forward along a predictable path, while their pursuers had taken the high ground. Jake could see the canyon mouth ahead, perhaps half a mile away where the trail opened onto a broad valley. If they could reach it, they'd have room to maneuver. But Duchess was laboring under the double burden, her breathing harsh and irregular. She couldn't maintain this pace much longer. A third shot struck sparks from the rock wall beside them, and Jake caught a glimpse of muzzle flash from a ledge high above. At least 2 shooters, probably more. Castellanos wasn't taking any chances. There, Elena pointed ahead to where a side canyon branched off to the right, barely visible in the moonlight. "That leads to the old Spanish mission. There might be water there." Jake hauled on the reins, and Duchess skidded around the turn with inches to spare. The side canyon was narrower than the main trail, forcing them to slow to a careful walk. But it also meant their pursuers couldn't get clear shots from above. "How do you know about this place?" Jake asked, checking over his shoulder for signs of pursuit. "My grandmother used to bring me here when I was small," Elena replied. "She said the mission was built on a sacred spring, that the water never runs dry even in the worst droughts." The canyon wound deeper into the mountains, climbing steadily through a landscape of twisted juniper and wind-carved stone. After 20 minutes of careful progress, they emerged into a circular valley perhaps a quarter-mile across. At its center stood the ruins of an old adobe church, its bell tower collapsed and its walls half melted by decades of rain and neglect. But Elena had been right about the water. Jake could hear it before he saw it, a small spring bubbling up from the rocks behind the mission, feeding a clear pool that reflected the stars like a mirror. They dismounted, and Jake led Duchess to drink while Elena knelt beside the pool, splashing water on her face and neck. The coolness of the high altitude was a relief after the furnace heat of the desert below, but Jake knew they couldn't stay long. "How many ways out of this valley?" he asked, scanning the rim for movement. Elena pointed to the far side, where another gap in the rocks was barely visible. "That trail leads to the main road, about 5 miles north of here, but it's steep and dangerous in the dark." Jake was about to reply when he heard the sound that made his blood run cold, the distinctive clip-clop of multiple horses entering the canyon behind them. Castellanos had found their trail after all. "How long before they reach us?" Jake asked, checking his weapons. He had the Colt at his hip, a Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard, and perhaps 40 rounds of ammunition total. Enough for a short fight, but not a siege. 10 minutes, maybe 15 if they're being careful, Elena said. She was looking around the ruined mission with the expression of someone making calculations. "Marshall, there's something else you should know about this place." Jake turned to stare at her. "Now, the mission wasn't abandoned because of Apache raids or drought," Elena continued urgently. "It was abandoned because the priests discovered something they didn't want to report to the church authorities, something valuable." Even in the moonlight, Jake could see that she was pointing to a section of the mission wall where the adobe had been repaired with different colored mud. "My grandmother's people used to mine silver from caves behind the spring. Small amounts, but very pure. The priests tried to take control of the mining, and that's when the trouble started." The sound of approaching horses was getting louder. Jake could hear voices now, speaking in rapid Spanish. Castellanos was being cautious, but he wasn't trying to hide his presence anymore. "Silver," Jake said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. That's what the survey team was really looking for. Not strategic minerals for military contracts, but silver deposits on your father's land. Elena nodded. "And if Vicente controls this valley, and the land around it, he controls access to all of it. That's why he can't let us go. Marshall, we know too much." Jake made his decision with the speed that had kept him alive through 15 years of dangerous work. "Can you find those caves?" "I think so." "But why?" "Because we're not running anymore," Jake said, pulling the Winchester from its scabbard. "They've got us outnumbered, and they know this country better than I do. Our only advantage is that they want you alive, which means they can't just shoot us down from a distance." He handed Alina the rifle and his spare ammunition. "Have you ever fired one of these?" "My father taught me," she said, working the lever. Action to chamber around. "But Marshal, there are 5 of them." "Then we'd better make sure we choose the ground for this fight," Jake replied, leading Duchess toward the ruined church. "Tell me about those caves." As Alina described the layout of the silver workings behind the mission, Jake studied the approaching riders. They had stopped at the valley entrance, probably discussing tactics. In the moonlight, he could make out their silhouettes, 5 men. Just as Alina had said, with Vicente Castellanos' distinctive hat and Serape marking him as their leader. Jake had spent years hunting dangerous men, but he'd always done it with the law on his side, with backup available, with the resources of territorial government behind him. Now he was on his own, protecting a woman who had become far more than just a witness to cattle rustling. She was the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached from local ranches to territorial offices, possibly all the way to federal contracts in Washington. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to do the right thing, he'd become an outlaw himself. But as he watched Alina check the rifle's sights with practiced competence, Jake realized that some rules were worth breaking. The riders were moving again, spreading out as they approached the mission. It was time to make their stand. Chapter 4. Breaking point. Dawn was still 2 hours away when Vicente Castellanos finally made his move. Jake had been watching from the bell tower ruins, tracking the outlaws as they positioned themselves around the mission. They'd been patient, professional, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came when one of Castellanos' men managed to work his way around to the spring, cutting off Jake and Elena's water supply and their escape route. To the caves, the man had moved like a ghost through the ruins, using every scrap of cover to stay hidden. Jake didn't spot him until it was too late. "We know you're in there, Marshal," Castellanos called out from his position behind a fallen wall. His accent was slight but noticeable. His English precise? "Send out the girl, and you can ride away from this. No harm to you." Jake glanced down at Alina, who was crouched behind the altar stone with the Winchester. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, he could see the grim determination in her face. They both knew what Castellanos' promise was worth. "Cautero fir, Vicente," Jake called back. "You and your boys ride out now, and I won't hang you for kidnapping when I bring you in." Castellanos' laugh echoed off the adobe walls. "You think like a lawman, Morrison, but out here, the law is what I say it is. And I say the girl belongs to me." A shot cracked from the direction of the spring, the bullet chipping stone inches from Jake's head. The man by the water had found a good angle on the bell tower. Jake was forced to duck lower, losing his vantage point on the other attackers. "They're moving," Alina whispered urgently. "Two coming from the left, one from the right." Jake slid down from the tower and took position at a gap in the mission wall. He could hear boots scraping on stone, the soft jingle of spurs. These men knew what they were doing. They were tightening the noose slowly, professionally. The first target appeared at the corner of the church, a lean man with a drooping mustache and crossed bandoliers. Jake put 2 rounds center mass, dropping him instantly. The sound of gunfire shattered the desert silence, and suddenly the night exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness from 3 different directions. Bullets whined off stone, and adobe, filling the air with dust and fragments. Jake worked his way along the wall, using the ruins for cover, trying to get a clear shot at the spring. He had to neutralize that position before they could be completely surrounded. Elena's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, and Jake heard someone cry out in pain. The girl could shoot, just as she'd claimed. But they were still outnumbered, and their ammunition wouldn't last forever. "Marshal," Elena's voice was urgent. "The cave's eye can see the entrance from here. If we can reach it, go," Jake said, reloading the Colt. "I'll cover you." But as Alina started to move, a new voice cut through the gunfire, younger, more desperate than Castellanos' controlled tones. "Vicente, no, she's my sister." The shooting stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Jake could hear his own heartbeat, Elena's sharp intake of breath, and somewhere in the darkness, Vicente Castellanos cursing in fluent Spanish. "Carlos." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "Carlos, is that you?" A figure emerged from behind the rubble near the spring, a young man, maybe 19 or 20, with Elena's dark hair and delicate features. He was holding a rifle, but it was pointed at the ground. "Elena, what are you doing here?" the young man called out. "Vicente said you were safe in Mesilla, that you'd agreed to marry him, that he's lying." "Carlos," Elena replied, her voice breaking for the first time since Jake had found her. "He took me from father's ranch. He chained me by the river like an animal." Jake watched the family drama unfold with growing understanding. Carlos Vasquez, Elena's brother, that explained how Castellanos had gotten information about the ranch, about Elena's father's business. The boy had been feeding Vicente intelligence, probably believing he was helping arrange a marriage between his sister and the outlaw leader. "She lies," Castellanos said smoothly, stepping into view with his hands raised peacefully. "Carlos, you know how women can be, emotional, dramatic. She's upset about the wedding arrangements, nothing more." But Carlos was staring at his sisters, torn dress, her bruised face, the rifle in her hands. Jake could see the exact moment when the young man realized the truth. His face went white, then dark with rage. "You son of a bitch," Carlos snarled, raising his rifle toward "You told me she wanted this? You told me?" Castellanos' hand moved with the speed of a striking snake. His pistol cleared leather and fired in one fluid motion, catching Carlos in the chest. The young man spun and fell, his rifle clattering across the stone. Elena's scream of anguish cut through Jake like a knife. She was up and running toward her brother before Jake could stop her, heedless of the crossfire. Jake had no choice but to follow, laying down covering fire as the remaining outlaws opened up again. Elena reached Carlos first, dropping to her knees beside him as bullets whined. Overhead, the young man was still alive, but fading fast, blood soaking the front of his shirt. "I'm sorry, Elena," Carlos whispered. I thought I was helping. Father wanted you married, wanted the ranch protected, and Vicente said, "Sheep," Elena murmured, cradling her brother's head. "It's not your fault. None of this is your fault." Jake reached them just as Carlos's eyes went empty. Around them, the gunfire was intensifying. Castellanos and his remaining men were closing in, no longer concerned about taking Elena alive. The death of their inside man had changed the rules of engagement. "Elena, we have to move," Jake said urgently. "Now." But Elena wasn't listening. She was staring down at her brother's body with an expression Jake had seen before on the faces of people pushed beyond their breaking point. When she looked up at him, her eyes held a coldness that made him take a step back. "Give me your gun," she said quietly. "Elena, give me your gun, Marshall, all of them." Jake looked around at their situation. They were pinned down in the open, outnumbered, low on ammunition. In a few minutes, Castellanos would work up the courage for a final rush, and it would all be over. Or Elena could end it herself. Jake handed her the Colt, keeping the Winchester. "You sure about this?" Elena checked the cylinder. Her movements quick and professional. "Vicente," she called out. "I want to talk." The shooting stopped again. After a moment, Castellanos' voice came from behind a pile of rubble about 30 yards away. "What is it, Quarita? Ready to come home with me?" Elena stood up slowly, the pistol hidden behind her back. "I want to see my brother buried properly. Christian burial, in consecrated ground." "Of course," Castellanos replied, his tone magnanimous. "I am not an unreasonable man. We can discuss the arrangements on our way back to." Elena stepped forward, bringing the Colt around in a smooth arc. "You can discuss it in hell." She fired 6 times, as fast as she could work the trigger. At 30 yards, 3 of the shots found their target. Vicente Castellanos staggered backward, looked down at the spreading stain on his shirt, and toppled over like a felled tree. The remaining outlaws, there were only 2 left, broke and ran. Jake could hear their horses' hoofbeats fading into the distance as they fled toward the desert. Within minutes, the valley was silent again except for the wind through the ruins and the soft bubbling of the spring. Elena walked over to where Castellanos lay and looked down at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Jake, her face calm again. "It's finished," she said simply. Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure anything was really finished. There would be questions, investigations, probably a territorial inquiry into the whole affair. The men in expensive suits from Santa Fe wouldn't give up their silver prospects easily. Elena's father would still face pressure to sell his land, and Jake himself might find his badge revoked for his actions tonight. But as the sun finally crested the mountains, painting the mission ruins golden red, Jake realized that some endings were worth the price. Elena Vasquez was free. The conspiracy might continue, but it would have to find new tools, new victims. And Marshal Jake Morrison had learned that sometimes the most important rules were the ones you had to break. They buried Carlos in the mission graveyard, among the weathered wooden crosses that marked the graves of Spanish priests and Apache converts from centuries past. Elena spoke a prayer in Spanish while Jake stood guard, watching the approaches to the valley. When it was done, they mounted Duchess together and rode toward Fort Stanton, carrying news of silver deposits and territorial corruption that would eventually reach Washington and change the balance of power in the New Mexico territory forever. But that's another story. This one ends with a woman freed from chains, a man freed from rigid thinking, and justice served under the endless sky of the American West, not because the law demanded it, but because sometimes doing right matters more than following rules.